After 10 years in federal prison for a crime I didn't commit, I came home to find my parents working as servants in their own house. My sister had taken everything. I called my old detective friend. It was time for answers. The first thing I noticed was my father on his knees in the garden, pulling weeds from flower beds he'd never planted. He was 71 years old, and his hands were caked with dirt up to his wrists. The August sun beat down on his back, and he wore a faded work shirt I didn't recognize, the kind you buy in bulk at discount stores. He didn't look up when the taxi pulled into the driveway. He just kept pulling weeds, methodical and silent, like a man who'd learned not to notice things that didn't concern him. I stood there for almost a full minute, holding my release papers in one hand and a plastic bag containing everything I owned in the other. This was the house I'd grown up in, a 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Ridge Lane in Westbrook, Connecticut. My grandfather built it in 1962. My father inherited it in 1989. I left it in 2014 as a successful investment banker being led away in handcuffs for securities fraud I didn't commit. I walked toward my father slowly, the gravel crunching under boots the prison had given me because my own shoes had long since disappeared. "Dad," I said. My voice came out rough, unused to speaking above a whisper after a decade of keeping my head down. He looked up then, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, then fear, then something I couldn't quite name. He glanced toward the house, quick and nervous, like a dog checking for its owner. "Daniel," he said quietly, "you're out." He didn't stand up. He didn't embrace me. He just stayed there on his knees in the dirt, looking at me like I was a ghost who'd shown up at the wrong address. "Where's Mom?" I asked. He pointed toward the house with a trembling finger. "Kitchen. She's preparing lunch." Preparing lunch. The phrase sat wrong in my mouth. My mother was 68 years old and had rheumatoid arthritis so severe she could barely hold a coffee cup without pain. I walked past him toward the front door, noting details that didn't match my memories. The brass knocker my grandfather had installed was gone, replaced with a modern digital doorbell. The welcome mat that had always read, "The Whitmore Family," was now plain gray rubber. The porch furniture, hand-carved oak benches my mother had inherited from her grandmother, had been replaced with cheap plastic chairs. I opened the door without knocking. It was still my house, or at least it was supposed to be. The interior had been gutted and redesigned. Gone were the family photographs that had lined the hallway. Gone were the antique rugs my parents had collected over 40 years of marriage. The walls were painted stark white, adorned with abstract art that looked expensive and soulless. I heard movement in the kitchen and followed the sound. My mother stood at the counter, chopping vegetables with hands that shook with every cut. She wore an apron I'd never seen before, and her hair had gone completely gray. She saw me in the doorway and dropped the knife. It clattered against the granite countertop, and she pressed her hand against her chest like she was trying to keep her heart from escaping. "Danny," she whispered. Then she looked past me, toward the staircase, and her expression changed to something approaching terror. "You shouldn't be here. Not yet. She's not expecting you." I felt ice form in my stomach. She? Who's she? But I already knew. The footsteps on the stairs confirmed it a moment later. Veronica descended like she owned the place, which I would soon learn she legally did. My sister was 39 years old, 3 years younger than me, and she'd always been the golden child. She wore designer clothes that probably cost more than my entire prison wardrobe, and her face had the tight, artificial smoothness of expensive cosmetic procedures. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth you'd use for a door-to-door salesman. "You're early. I wasn't expecting you until next week." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this woman with the little sister who'd cried at my trial, who'd sworn she believed in my innocence, who'd promised to visit every month. She'd come twice in 10 years. Twice. "What is this?" I asked, gesturing at the house, at my mother's apron, at everything that felt wrong. "What did you do?" Veronica smiled, and there was nothing sisterly in it. "I saved this family while you were gone. Someone had to. The legal fees from your defense nearly bankrupted Mom and Dad, the medical bills when Dad had his heart attack, the property taxes, the maintenance, everything. They couldn't handle it alone." My mother made a small sound, somewhere between a whimper and a protest. "That's not exactly—" "Mom," Veronica cut her off, voice sharp as glass. "Why don't you finish making lunch? Daniel and I need to talk privately." My mother nodded, picked up the knife, and went back to chopping, like a servant following orders. My hands started shaking, but not from fear, from rage. I followed Veronica into what used to be my father's study. It had been converted into a home office with sleek furniture and multiple monitors. She sat behind the desk like a CEO preparing to fire an employee. "Let me explain how things work now," she said. "When you went to prison, everything fell apart. Dad's pension wasn't enough. Mom's Social Security barely covered her medications. They were 3 months behind on the mortgage when I stepped in. I paid off the house. I covered their debts. In exchange, they signed over the deed." I felt the room tilt slightly. They signed over the house? They had no choice. I saved them from foreclosure. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk. "It's all documented, legal, witnessed, notarized." I didn't touch the folder. And now they what? Work for you? As servants in their own home? Veronica shrugged. They contribute. Dad maintains the grounds. Mom helps with meals and cleaning. It's not servitude, Daniel. It's family. I wanted to flip the desk. I wanted to put my fist through the wall. 10 years in federal prison teaches you many things, and one of them is how to control your reactions when everything inside you is screaming. I kept my voice level. Where's my share? Veronica blinked. Your share of what? Grandpa's trust. When I went away, there was almost $2 million in the family trust. Half of that was designated for me. She laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not exactly. More like the laugh of someone who'd anticipated this question and had prepared an answer. Gone. Legal fees, medical bills, property rehabilitation. Your conviction cost this family everything, Daniel. The trust was depleted within 5 years. I studied her face, looking for tells. In prison, you learn to read people. You learn when someone's lying, when they're scared, when they're about to make a move. Veronica's face was smooth and confident, but her left hand, resting on the desk, kept tapping a rhythm against the wood. Nervous. She was nervous. I left the house without another word. My mother tried to say something as I passed through the kitchen, but Veronica's voice followed me down the hallway. Let him go, Mom. He needs time to adjust. I walked for 3 miles until I found a bus stop. I had $47 in cash that the prison had given me upon release, my release papers, and a prepaid phone with 20 minutes of credit. I used 15 of those minutes on a single call. Frank, I said when he answered. It's Daniel Whitmore. Silence on the other end. Then, Danny? Jesus Christ, you're out? Frank Castellano had been my friend since college. We'd roomed together at Georgetown, stayed close through the years. When I'd gone into investment banking, he'd joined the NYPD. By the time I was arrested, he'd made detective. By the time I was convicted, he'd transferred to the FBI's white-collar crime division. He was the only person outside my family who'd believed in my innocence from day one. I need your help, I said. Something's wrong, with my family, with everything. I explained what I'd seen, what Veronica had told me, the way my parents had looked and acted. Frank was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Where are you right now? I looked around. I was standing at a bus shelter on Route 15, watching cars pass by. Nowhere, between places. Get to Hartford. There's a Marriott on Asylum Street. I'll book you a room for a week. We'll meet tomorrow. I hesitated. Frank, I don't have any money. Everything I had is supposedly gone. I know, he said. That's why I'm helping. Something never sat right about your case, Danny. I've been looking into it on my own time for years. I think your conviction wasn't just a mistake. I think it was manufactured. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 10 years telling myself the same thing, but hearing someone else say it made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. The hotel room was nicer than anywhere I'd slept in a decade. I stood in the shower for almost an hour, letting hot water run over me until my skin turned red. Prison showers are timed. 3 minutes. Cold water. No privacy. I dried off with towels that felt like clouds and sat on the bed in the hotel's complimentary robe, trying to process everything. My parents. Working in their own home. Answering to my sister like employees. The house stripped of everything that made it ours. The trust, my inheritance, my future, supposedly gone. I pulled out the prepaid phone and opened the web browser. It was painfully slow, but I managed to search for news about my case. The headlines were 10 years old, but they still stung. Investment banker Daniel Whitmore convicted of $12 million securities fraud. Whitmore gets 15 years, says he's innocent. Family of fraud, victims, celebrates conviction. I'd served 10 years of a 15-year sentence. Good behavior. Model prisoner. The parole board had noted my exceptional rehabilitation and acceptance of responsibility. I'd never accepted responsibility. I'd accepted that no one would believe me if I kept protesting. Frank arrived the next morning at 8 sharp, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a briefcase that looked heavier than it should be. He'd aged in the decade since I'd last seen him in person. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and deep lines creased his forehead. But his eyes were the same, sharp, watchful, the eyes of a man who spent his life looking for what people tried to hide. You look like hell, he said, handing me a coffee. You look old, I replied. He laughed, and for a moment, it felt like we were back in college, trading insults over breakfast in the dining hall. Then the moment passed, and his expression turned serious. I've been investigating your case for 6 years, he said, opening the briefcase. Unofficially, using my own time, my own resources. He spread documents across the bed. What I've found is going to make you very angry. The first document was a bank statement from 2013, the year before my arrest. It showed a wire transfer of $800,000 from an account I'd never seen before to an account in the Cayman Islands. This transfer was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against you, Frank said. They claimed you initiated it using your credentials at Pemberton Financial, that you'd been siphoning client funds for months. I stared at the statement. I never made this transfer. I never even had access to the system that would have been required. I know, because I traced the actual origin. He pulled out another document, this one highlighted in yellow. The transfer was initiated from an IP address registered to a computer at your firm, but not your computer. It was made from the workstation assigned to your direct supervisor, Gregory Ashworth. The name sent a jolt through me. Gregory Ashworth had been my mentor at Pemberton Financial. He'd recruited me out of business school, promoted me twice, stood as best man at my wedding. He'd also testified against me at trial, claiming he'd suspected my unethical behavior for months before the fraud was discovered. Gregory set me up? I asked, though the answer was already forming in my mind. Gregory was the fall guy's fall guy, Frank said. He made the transfer on someone else's instructions. Someone who needed a scapegoat and picked you because you were the most vulnerable target in the firm. Young, ambitious, trusting. You'd signed off on documentation he put in front of you without reading every line, just like every other junior associate. I remembered those late nights, those stacks of papers, Gregory assuring me it was routine, nothing to worry about, just sign here. Who was giving him instructions? Frank hesitated. This was the part he hadn't wanted to tell me. I could see it in the way his shoulders tensed. Your sister, he said quietly. Veronica was having an affair with Gregory, had been for 2 years before your arrest. She was also deeply in debt, gambling mostly. Online poker that turned into a serious addiction. She owed money to people who don't accept payment plans. I felt the room spin. No. No. Frank pulled out photographs. My sister and Gregory at a restaurant sitting too close. My sister and Gregory entering a hotel, time-stamped receipts from the hotel. I got these from a private investigator who was working for Gregory's wife at the time, Frank explained. She suspected the affair and hired someone to follow him. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Veronica was the one pulling the strings. He showed me more documents, bank records showing deposits into accounts my sister controlled. Deposits that coincided exactly with the dates of the fraudulent transfers from Pemberton Financial. Veronica needed money. Gregory provided access. You provided cover. It was elegant, really. A perfect frame. I thought about my trial. My sister crying on the witness stand, talking about how I'd changed in the months before my arrest, how I'd seemed stressed and secretive. The jury had eaten it up. She testified against me, I said, the words barely audible. Her own brother. She testified against me to save herself. There's more, Frank said, and his voice carried a weight that told me the worst was still coming. He pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the others. After your conviction, the money kept flowing. Not from Pemberton. That well dried up when you went away. But Veronica found other sources. I opened the folder and started reading. What I found made me sick. Veronica had systematically dismantled everything my parents owned. The family trust hadn't been depleted by legal fees and medical bills. It had been transferred piece by piece into accounts she controlled. She'd forged my parents' signatures on documents. She'd used their power of attorney, which they'd granted during my father's heart attack recovery, to sell off assets they didn't even know they owned. The house my grandfather built, had been remortgaged 3 times. Each mortgage was used to pay off Veronica's gambling debts, then refinanced with new terms. My parents never saw a dime. And when they couldn't make payments anymore, she'd generously offered to pay off the balance in exchange for the deed. She didn't save them, I said, my voice hollow. She created the problem, then presented herself as the solution. Frank nodded. It's a classic manipulation pattern. Create dependency, then exploit it. Your parents think they owe her everything. They don't know she's the reason they lost everything in the first place. I thought about my mother in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with arthritic hands. My father on his knees in the garden, pulling weeds in the August heat. They weren't just servants. They were prisoners, trapped by gratitude for their captor. How do I prove this? I asked. How do I make her pay? Frank closed the briefcase. That's where it gets complicated. Most of this evidence would be inadmissible in court. I obtained it through unofficial channels, and the statute of limitations on the financial fraud has expired for some of the earlier transactions. But there's one thing that never expires. He looked me in the eyes. Your wrongful conviction. If we can prove you were framed, everything else unravels. The next 3 weeks were a blur of documents, meetings, and carefully planned surveillance. Frank introduced me to Nathan Prescott, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. He was 52 years old, had overturned 11 convictions in his career, and had a reputation for being relentless. He reviewed Frank's evidence in a single night and called me at 6 a.m. the next morning. This is prosecutorial misconduct, perjury, and fraud, Nathan said, his voice tight with controlled anger. The original prosecutor should have disclosed the connection between your sister and Gregory Ashworth. The fact that he didn't means either he was incompetent or complicit. We scheduled a meeting with Assistant District Attorney Michelle Ogawa, who handled conviction integrity cases for the state. She was 44 years old, had been with the DA's office for 18 years, and had a personal mission to correct wrongful convictions. She listened to our presentation for 2 hours without interrupting. When we finished, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. I remember this case, she said. I was a junior prosecutor back then, not involved directly, but I remember thinking the evidence seemed almost too neat. Everything lined up perfectly. That doesn't usually happen in real fraud cases. Because it was manufactured, Nathan said. Daniel Whitmore was set up by his sister and her lover, and the original prosecution either missed the connections or ignored them. Michelle tapped her pen against her notepad. I can open an investigation, quietly at first, but I'm going to need more than circumstantial evidence to move forward. I need someone to talk. I knew who she meant. Gregory Ashworth was still alive, still living in Connecticut, though his career had never recovered from the scandal. He'd been forced out of Pemberton Financial a year after my conviction, officially for unrelated performance issues. Unofficially, the firm had discovered irregularities that they'd chosen to bury rather than investigate. I'll talk to him, I said. Michelle shook her head. You can't. Direct contact between you and a potential witness would compromise the investigation. But there might be another way. Frank had maintained contact with Gregory's ex-wife, Diana, who had divorced him shortly after my trial. She'd suspected for years that Gregory was hiding something, that his testimony against me hadn't been entirely truthful. She'd never known what to do with those suspicions until Frank reached out. Diana agreed to meet with Michelle. The conversation was recorded with her consent, and what she revealed changed everything. Gregory came home drunk one night about 6 months after Daniel's conviction, Diana said in the recording. He was crying, saying he'd ruined an innocent man's life, that he'd had no choice, that she'd threatened to expose the affair to me and to their employer if he didn't cooperate. She, Veronica. Michelle asked for more details, and Diana provided them. Gregory had kept records, not official ones, but personal notes, documenting everything Veronica had made him do. He'd hidden them in a safety deposit box, too afraid to destroy them, too afraid to use them. He called it his insurance policy, Diana said, in case she ever turned on him. Gregory Ashworth was approached by federal agents on a Thursday afternoon. He was given a choice: cooperate fully and receive immunity for his role in the fraud, or face prosecution for perjury, securities fraud, and conspiracy. He chose immunity. The contents of his safety deposit box exceeded even Frank's expectations. There were records of every transaction, every communication, every instruction Veronica had given. There were recordings, actual audio recordings, of conversations between them, planning the frame, discussing how to make sure I would take the fall. There was a document in Veronica's own handwriting outlining which of my signatures to forge and which to obtain through legitimate-looking means. He was building a case against her, Frank said when he saw the materials. All those years, he was building a case in case he ever needed to save himself. It took 4 more weeks for the investigation to reach its conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, the kind of case that prosecutors dream about. I spent those weeks visiting my parents, carefully, always when Veronica was away. I couldn't tell them what was happening. The investigation required secrecy, but I could start planting seeds of doubt. Do you remember signing documents that gave Veronica control of the trust? I asked my mother one afternoon. She looked confused. I don't. There were so many papers. After your conviction, after your father's heart attack, Veronica handled everything. She said we didn't need to worry. Did you read what you were signing? My mother's hands trembled. I couldn't. My eyes, the medications. Veronica read them to us. She explained what each one meant. I felt a cold fury settle in my chest. My sister had exploited my parents' trust, their grief, their physical limitations. She'd read them documents that stripped away their rights while telling them they were protecting their future. Mom, I said gently, do you still have copies of those papers? She shook her head. Veronica keeps all the important documents in her office. She said it was safer that way, in case there was ever a fire or something. I relayed this information to Nathan, who obtained a court order to access Veronica's financial records as part of the investigation. What he found confirmed everything we suspected. The documents my parents had signed contained their signatures, but forensic analysis revealed they were traced, carefully copied from legitimate signatures on other documents, then reproduced on the fraudulent ones. My parents had never actually signed away their home, their trust, their financial security. They'd been robbed without ever knowing it. Michelle Ogawa presented the case to a grand jury on a rainy Monday in October. The indictment came back the same day. Veronica Whitmore was charged with securities fraud, perjury, forgery, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Gregory Ashworth testified before the grand jury, confirming every detail. The arrest warrant was issued at 2:14 p.m. I was there when they served it. I'd requested permission to be present, and Michelle had agreed, understanding that I needed to see this moment. The police arrived at my parents' house, my grandfather's house, with 4 officers and a detective. Frank had flown up from Washington specifically to witness the culmination of his 6 years of unofficial investigation. Veronica answered the door in workout clothes, a yoga mat under her arm. She was planning to attend her 3 p.m. Pilates class, unaware that her schedule was about to change dramatically. Veronica Whitmore? The lead officer said. She smiled, that confident, practiced smile I'd seen so many times. Yes? You're under arrest for securities fraud, perjury, forgery, and elder financial abuse. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The smile vanished. Her face went pale, then red. Her eyes found me standing at the edge of the driveway, and for the first time in my memory, I saw genuine fear in my sister's expression. "You!" she spat. "This is your doing." I didn't respond. I just watched as they handcuffed her and led her to the waiting police car. My parents emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion. My mother was crying. My father looked confused, lost, like a man waking from a long nightmare and not recognizing where he was. "What's happening?" my mother asked. "What did Veronica do?" I walked toward them slowly, the same way I'd approached my father in the garden on the day I came home. "She lied," I said simply. "About everything. The money, the house, my conviction. All of it was lies." My mother shook her head, not in denial, but in the way you shake off a dream that doesn't make sense. "I don't understand." "You will," I said. "I'll explain everything. But first, I need you to know something." I took her hands in mine, gently, mindful of her arthritis. "You don't work for anyone anymore. This is your home. It always was. And no one is ever going to take it from you again." The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming, and Veronica's defense attorney struggled to mount any meaningful opposition. Gregory Ashworth testified for 4 hours, detailing every aspect of the conspiracy. Bank records showed the flow of money. Forensic handwriting experts confirmed the forged signatures. My parents testified via video, my mother weeping as she described how Veronica had manipulated them, how they'd believed they owed her their lives when she'd actually stolen everything they had. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month, but the judge denied bail, citing flight risk and the severity of the crimes. Veronica was led away in handcuffs, just as I had been 10 years earlier. She didn't look at me as they took her out, but I looked at her. I wanted to remember this moment, the moment when everything she'd built on lies finally collapsed. My own conviction was vacated 2 weeks later in a separate proceeding. Judge Richard Novak, who presided over the hearing, issued a written opinion that ran 18 pages. "Daniel Whitmore was the victim of a calculated conspiracy to obstruct justice," he wrote. "The evidence demonstrates that his conviction was secured through perjury, manufactured evidence, and the deliberate withholding of exculpatory information. This court finds that Mr. Whitmore is actually innocent of the charges for which he was convicted, and orders that all records of his conviction be expunged." Actually innocent. Not just a procedural error, not just insufficient evidence. Actually innocent. I sat in the courtroom with Frank and Nathan on either side of me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in over a decade. Freedom. Real freedom. Not just the absence of prison walls, but the restoration of my name, my identity, my truth. The state would later award me compensation for wrongful imprisonment, though no amount of money could truly repay 10 years of lost life. The forensic accountants worked for months to untangle Veronica's financial schemes. In the end, they recovered almost $1.8 million in assets that rightfully belonged to my parents and the family trust. The house was transferred back to my parents' names, free and clear. The fraudulent mortgages were voided by court order, with the banks forced to absorb the losses due to their failure to verify the signature authenticity. Veronica was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The judge, a woman named Eleanor Huang, who had a reputation for harsh sentences in elder abuse cases, called the crimes particularly egregious and a profound betrayal of family trust. 18 years. 8 more than I had served. I tried not to find satisfaction in that, but I'd be lying if I said I succeeded completely. Justice isn't the same as revenge, but sometimes they look similar from the outside. 6 months after the sentencing, I stood in my grandfather's house, truly my parents' house again, and watched my father reading the newspaper in his favorite chair. It was the same chair that had been sold off and replaced with modern furniture during Veronica's reign. I'd found it at an estate sale in New Haven and bought it back for 3 times what it was worth. My mother was in the kitchen, not cooking because she had to, but because she wanted to. We'd hired a part-time aide to help with the heavy cleaning, someone who treated my parents with the respect they deserved. The house still needed work. Veronica had let the infrastructure decay while pouring money into surface aesthetics. The roof needed replacing. The plumbing was ancient. But we had time, and we had resources, and most importantly, we had each other. Frank called me that evening to share news. The original prosecutor in my case, a man named Harold Brennan, had resigned from the bar following an ethics investigation. While there wasn't enough evidence to prove he'd knowingly participated in the frame, the investigation had revealed significant lapses in professional judgment that made his continued practice untenable. "It's not prison," Frank said, "but it's something. His career is over. His reputation is destroyed. He'll never practice law again." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Harold Brennan had stood in a courtroom and argued that I was a criminal, that I deserved to lose a decade of my life. He'd built his case on lies and either didn't notice or didn't care. Now he was the one facing consequences. Not the same consequences I'd faced, but consequences nonetheless. I'd learned something in prison about justice and revenge and the space between them. You can't get back what you've lost. You can't unbreak what's been broken. But you can rebuild, and you can make sure the people who hurt you can't hurt anyone else. That's not revenge. That's just setting things right. I visited Veronica in prison once, about a year after her conviction. I don't entirely know why I went. Curiosity, maybe. Or a need to understand something I'd never been able to comprehend. She looked different in the orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow, like the designer clothes and expensive treatments had been armor that protected her from appearing human. We sat across from each other at a metal table in the visitation room, guards watching from every corner. Why? I asked. It was the only question that mattered. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not remorse, exactly. More like exhaustion. Because I could, she said finally. Because you had everything I wanted. The career, the respect, the future. Mom and Dad were always so proud of you. Golden boy Daniel, going to change the world. She laughed, bitter and hollow. I was drowning in debt and no one even noticed, so I found a way to make it your problem instead. I left the prison that day and drove to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. I sat by his grave for an hour, not saying anything, just existing in the space where he'd been laid to rest. He'd built that house with his own hands, brick by brick, dreaming of the family that would grow within its walls. He couldn't have imagined what would happen decades later, how his granddaughter would try to steal it, how his grandson would go to prison for crimes he didn't commit. But the house was still standing. The family, what remained of it, was healing. And the truth, which had been buried for so long, was finally free. My parents lived for another 4 years after that. My father passed first, peacefully, in his sleep. My mother followed 8 months later, as if she simply couldn't imagine life without him. They spent their final years in comfort and dignity, surrounded by the memories and possessions that Veronica had tried to strip away. I inherited the house, of course. I thought about selling it for a long time. The memories were complicated, joy and trauma intertwined like vines that couldn't be separated without destroying both. In the end, I decided to keep it. I renovated it from top to bottom, restoring what could be saved and replacing what couldn't. I found old photographs in boxes that Veronica had shoved into storage, and I hung them back on the walls where they belonged. My grandfather as a young man, breaking ground on the property. My parents at their wedding, eyes bright with hope. Me and Veronica as children, before everything went wrong, when we were just siblings playing in the backyard, innocent of the futures waiting for us. I kept those photographs too. It would have been easy to destroy them, to pretend Veronica had never existed, to erase her from the family history the way she'd tried to erase my parents' ownership of their home. But that's not how truth works. You can't selectively remember only the parts that don't hurt. I'm 52 years old now. I never remarried after my wife divorced me during the trial. She couldn't handle the scandal, the stigma, the collapse of the life we'd planned together. I don't blame her. Prison changes you in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. You learn to trust no one, to expect betrayal, to find comfort in isolation. Those habits don't disappear just because the cell door opens. But I've built a new life, different from the one I lost, but meaningful in its own way. I work as a consultant for wrongful conviction advocacy groups, helping people navigate the legal system I was swallowed by. I've testified before state legislatures about the need for conviction integrity units and better oversight of prosecutorial conduct. I've helped 3 other innocent people win their freedom. It's not the career I imagined when I graduated from business school, but it's the one I was meant to have. Some paths you choose, others choose you. Frank retired from the FBI last year. We still talk every week, still meet for dinner when he's in Connecticut. He saved my life, not literally, but in every way that matters. Without his 6 years of quiet investigation, without his refusal to believe in my guilt, I would have served my full sentence and come home to find my parents' graves instead of my parents. I owe him everything, and he refuses to let me repay him. You would have done the same for me, he says whenever I try to thank him. He's right, I would have. That's what friends do. They believe in you when no one else will. They keep looking for the truth when everyone else has given up. They stand beside you in courtrooms and graveyards and everywhere in between. Veronica is still in prison. She'll be eligible for parole in another 6 years. I don't know if I'll oppose it when the time comes. I don't know if I care anymore. She took 10 years from me, and she's giving back at least that many of her own. It's not a fair trade. Nothing could be. But it's as close to balance as the universe allows. The house is quiet now. I sit in my grandfather's study most evenings, in a chair I bought to replace the one Veronica installed, and I read or I write or I simply exist in the silence. Sometimes I think about the person I might have become if none of this had happened, if my sister hadn't been consumed by jealousy and greed, if Gregory Ashworth hadn't been weak enough to help her. That Daniel Whitmore would be a wealthy investment banker with a corner office and a vacation home and all the trappings of success. He would also be naive, trusting, blind to the darkness that lives in the hearts of people you love. I'm not naive anymore. I'm not trusting. But I'm not bitter either. Bitterness is a prison of its own, and I've spent enough time behind walls. The truth set me free, literally and metaphorically. It took 10 years and cost me more than I can calculate, but it came. That's the thing about truth. You can bury it. You can deny it. You can build elaborate lies on top of it. But eventually, it surfaces. It always surfaces. I keep a photograph on my desk now, one that I found in my mother's belongings after she passed. It shows our whole family, my parents, me, Veronica, standing in front of the house on the day we moved in. I was 12. Veronica was 9. We're both grinning at the camera, excited about our new home, unaware of everything that lay ahead. I look at that photograph sometimes and try to understand when things went wrong, when my sister became someone capable of such cruelty. I never find an answer. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe some people just break in ways that can't be explained or fixed, and the rest of us are left to clean up the wreckage. All I know for certain is this. I survived. My parents died with their dignity restored. The truth was told. And the house my grandfather built still stands, filled with memories both painful and precious, a testament to a family that endured more than it should have had to endure, but endured nonetheless. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.